My name is Isla Voss, and I am 31 years old. And my mother's name was Catherine Voss, and she died on a Monday in September of a cardiac event that the hospital described as sudden and unsurvivable, and she was 64 years old, and she had been in reasonable health, and I had spoken to her on the Sunday evening, and she had asked me how work was, and I had told her, and she had said that was good, and that she was tired, and that she would call me in the week. And those were the last words she said to me, which were ordinary words spoken by a woman who did not know. They were the last ones, and I had not known either. And there is a particular quality to that kind of ending, which is that it does not feel like an ending at all until several days afterward, when you are standing in the kitchen of the house she lived in, and you are holding a cardboard box. And the silence is doing what I described. I had been told by the solicitor that the estate was straightforward, which was a small terraced house in a quiet part of Bristol that my mother had owned outright, and a savings account with a modest balance and no outstanding debts and no complications. And I had thanked him, and I had come to the house on the Friday morning to begin the process of sorting through her belongings. And I had started in the kitchen, because the kitchen felt like the least personal room. And I had been wrong about that, because the kitchen was full of the specific and intimate evidence of a life lived quietly and alone, which was a single mug on the drying rack and a notepad beside the telephone with a list of things she had meant to do and a jar of the particular tea she drank every evening that I had given her for her birthday. And I stood in the kitchen for a long time before I put anything in the box. I worked through the ground floor rooms methodically the way I do everything, which is without rushing and without allowing myself to think too far ahead. And by early afternoon, I had moved upstairs to the bedroom. And the bedroom was where I found the first thing that did not fit. My mother was not a complicated woman in the way that she presented herself to the world. And I had grown up understanding her as a person of quiet habits and limited sentimentality who kept what was necessary and discarded what was not. And her bedroom reflected this, which was that it was orderly and undecorated and contained nothing that did not serve a practical purpose. And I had been working through the wardrobe and the bedside table when I noticed the bottom drawer of the small writing desk in the corner of the room. And I noticed it because it had a lock, and the lock was the kind that is not decorative but functional, which is a small brass mechanism that requires a specific key, and the key was not in the drawer and was not on the hook behind the bedroom door where my mother kept her keys. And I looked at the locked drawer for a while, and then I went downstairs, and I found a letter opener in the kitchen drawer, and I came back upstairs, and I did what anyone does when they are the only person left who has the right to know what is inside something. It took 4 minutes. The drawer contained 3 things. The first was a folded document that I recognized as a birth certificate, and I unfolded it, and I read it, and it was my birth certificate which I had known she kept, and I set it aside. And I looked at the second thing, which was a brown envelope with nothing written on the outside. And I opened it, and inside was a photograph of my mother that I had never seen before. And in the photograph, she was perhaps 30 years old, and she was standing on a street that was not in England, and the architecture behind her was French in the specific way that certain French cities are unmistakably French, and she was not looking at the camera. And she had the expression of a person who does not know they are being photographed, and the photograph had a quality to it that I could not immediately name, and that I later understood was the quality of a person existing unselfconsciously in a place where they feel entirely at home. And I put the photograph down, and I picked up the third thing. The third thing was a passport. It was a French passport. It was navy blue with the gold emblem on the cover, and it was issued by the Republic of France. And I opened it, and I looked at the photograph page, and the photograph was my mother, and the face was my mother's face, and the eyes were my mother's eyes, And the name on the passport was not Catherine Voss. The name on the passport was Elise Moreau. It had been issued 28 years ago, and it had expired 16 years ago, and it had entry stamps from 7 countries. 3 of which my mother had told me she had never visited, and 1 of which she had told me she had never wanted to visit, and I turned the pages slowly, and I looked at each stamp, and I looked at the dates, and I held the passport in both hands for a long time in the quiet of the bedroom that had held one woman for 22 years. And I thought about my mother's face in the photograph on the street in the French city. And I thought about the expression on that face, which was a person at home. And I thought about the fact that I had never in 31 years seen my mother look like that in England. I thought about the things that I had always known about her without ever having examined them directly. I thought about the way she turned away from cameras at family gatherings and had always framed this as not liking photographs. And I thought about the way she changed the channel when certain news programs came on and had always framed this as not liking the news. And I thought about the way she had no social media presence of any kind and had always framed this as not understanding technology. And I thought about the way she had responded when I suggested a trip to France for her 60th birthday. And the response had been immediate and firm and framed as simply not wanting to travel that far. And I thought about all of these things which I had stored separately in my understanding of her as individual quirks. And I thought about what they look like when you place them beside a French passport in a different name found in a locked drawer. And what they looked like was not quirks. What they looked like was a system. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I held the passport in both hands. I looked at the name Elise Moreau. And I thought about the woman I had buried the day before. And I thought about the name on the headstone, which was Catherine Voss. And I thought about 31 years of a life lived beside a person who had answered to that name and cooked in that kitchen and drunk that particular tea every evening and asked me how work was on the last Sunday of her life. And I understood that I did not know who I had buried. I understood that I had never known. And I understood that the knowing was only just beginning. I did not sleep on Thursday night. I sat on the bedroom floor with my back against the bed and the passport open in my lap and the lamp on the bedside table casting the kind of light that makes a room feel smaller than it is. And I sat there for a long time, doing what I do when something does not make sense, which is looking at it from every angle I can find until either the sense reveals itself or I accept that the sense is not available from where I am currently standing and requires me to move. I looked at the passport for a long time. The photograph was my mother at approximately 30 years old, and the face was completely recognizable as the face of the woman I had known. And the eyes were the same, and the set of the mouth was the same, and there was nothing altered or composite about the image, and it was simply her face attached to a name that was not the name I had grown up saying, and the name was Elise Moreau, and it was printed in the clean official typography of a French government document, and it had not been forged because I turned every page and examined every detail, and the paper quality and the binding and the stamp impressions were all consistent with a genuine document issued by a genuine authority. And my mother had carried it and kept it in a locked drawer for 22 years, and had never mentioned it and had never explained it, and was now in the ground in a cemetery on the east side of Bristol, under a headstone that said, Catherine Voss. At some point after midnight, I opened my phone, I typed the name Elise Moreau into the search engine, and I added France. And then I added Bristol. And then I removed Bristol and tried Paris. And then Lyon. And then Bordeaux. And then I removed the city entirely and searched the name alone. And what I received across every variation of that search was the ordinary noise of the internet, which contained several social media profiles belonging to women who were clearly alive and clearly not my mother, and a handful of professional listings and a genealogy forum entry, and nothing that connected to a woman in her 60s who had lived in England for over 2 decades. And nothing that connected to a woman who might have been the age my mother would have been when the passport was issued. And nothing that suggested the name had ever belonged to someone who had done anything that left a digital trace. I tried the French civil registry search tools that are publicly accessible. I tried the electoral roll databases. I tried the newspaper archive. Search engines that index French regional press going back 40 years. I found nothing. I want to tell you what finding nothing means when you are looking for a real person. 'Cause I think people underestimate it. And finding nothing does not mean the person did not exist. And finding nothing online about a real person who lived a real life means that the record of that life has been removed. And removal of that kind does not happen passively and does not happen through neglect and requires deliberate and skilled intervention by someone who understood which records existed and how to access them and how to ensure that what remained was nothing. And the nothing I was looking at had the same quality as the locked drawer, which was the quality of something that had been made deliberately and maintained carefully. And I sat on the floor with the passport in my lap and the phone in my hand, and I looked at the nothing for a long time. In the morning, I drove to the solicitor's office. The solicitor was a man named Gerald Firth, who had handled my mother's affairs for at least 15 years, and who had called me the morning after she died with the measured professional sympathy of a man accustomed to delivering news of this kind. And I had spoken to him twice since about the estate, and he had been pleasant and cooperative. And when I arrived at his office without an appointment on the Friday morning, his assistant showed me in after a brief wait, and he stood to greet me with the same measured warmth. And I sat down across from his desk, and I told him that I was trying to locate the original identification documents my mother had used when she purchased the house 22 years ago, because I had found something in her belongings that I needed to understand, and I needed to see what name she had used on the original conveyancing documentation. The warmth did not leave his face immediately. It left gradually the way light leaves a room when a cloud moves across the sun, which is not dramatically, but in a way that changes the quality of everything in the room without anything visibly moving, and he said that records of that age were permanently archived and that accessing them would require a formal request and a processing period of several weeks. And I said that I understood and that I was happy to make a formal request, and could he give me the form? And he said that the request would need to go through the firm's document management team directly, and that he would have his assistant send me the details. And I said thank you, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and in the space between those two looks was something that I had not seen in his face during any of our previous conversations, which was a very controlled and very deliberate absence of reaction. And a controlled absence of reaction is not the same as calm. And I know the difference. I left his office. I drove to Sarah Hendricks. Sarah had been my mother's closest friend for as long as I could remember, and I had grown up calling her Auntie Sarah in the way that children adopt the close friends of their parents as honorary family. And she was 71 years old, and she lived in a semi-detached house in Clifton, and she had been at the funeral and had held my hand during the service and had cried in the open, unguarded way that people cry when they have known someone for a very long time. She opened the door when she saw me through the window, and she was already saying something warm, and she was already stepping back to let me in. And I came into the hallway, and I took the passport out of my bag, and I held it out to her, and I said, I found this in a locked drawer, and I need you to tell me who Elise Moreau is." Sarah looked at the passport. The color left her face in the specific total way that color leaves a face when the body has received information that the mind has not yet processed. And she reached out and put one hand on the wall beside her, and I stepped forward in case she needed steadying. And she looked at me, and her eyes had changed in the way that eyes change when a person has been waiting for something for a very long time and has just understood that the waiting is over. She said your name very quietly. She said, "Come inside and close the door, and do not stand where you can be seen from the street." I came inside. I closed the door. She sat down heavily in the chair by the window, and she looked at the passport in my hand for a long time. And then she looked at me and she said that I was not supposed to find that, and that my mother had lived a lie for 31 years, and that the lie was not a betrayal, and that the lie was the only reason I was alive. She told me to burn the passport. She told me to go home and burn it and forget the name and forget the drawer and stop asking questions. Before the people who had been watching for that name for 31 years noticed that someone had started looking for it. I looked at her, I looked at the passport, and I understood that the woman I had buried was not the beginning of this story. She was the middle of it. I left Sarah's house at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the September air was cold in the specific way that September air in Bristol is cold, which is not the full cold of winter, but the first suggestion of it. And I walked to my car, and I sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, and I thought about what Sarah had said, and I thought about the word alive and the specific way she had used it, which was not as a figure of speech and not as an expression of emotional stakes, but as a plain statement of physical fact. And I thought about her hand on the wall and the color leaving her face. And I thought about a solicitor who had become careful, in a way. He had not been careful before. And I started the engine and I pulled out into the road. I noticed the car 4 minutes later. It was dark, and it was 2 cars behind me, and I noticed it the way you notice something that your peripheral awareness has already logged before your conscious attention has caught up. And when I turned left onto the Clifton Road, it turned left, and when I took the longer route toward the center, because I was not ready to go back to the house, it stayed the distance of 2 cars behind me through every turn. And I want to tell you that I handled this with complete calm. But what I felt in those first minutes was something that I can only describe as the physical sensation of a world that had been solid, becoming briefly and terrifyingly negotiable beneath my feet. And then I took a breath and I thought about what Sarah had said, and I understood that she had not been speaking in metaphors. I drove to Temple Meads Station. I parked in the multi-story, and I walked quickly into the main concourse, and I positioned myself in the middle of the afternoon crowd near the departures board, where I could see every entrance and where the noise of the station would make it impossible for anyone to approach without being visible from a distance. And I stood there for several minutes, and I watched the entrances, and I did not see anyone from the car. And I did not see anyone whose attention appeared to be directed at me, and I allowed my breathing to return to its normal rate, and I thought about what to do next. I took the passport out of my bag. I had not burned it. I had not been able to burn it. And I had known in Sarah's hallway that I was not going to burn it. The same way that I had known in my mother's bedroom that I was not going to leave the locked drawer unopened. And I turned to the back of the passport, and I went through each of the plastic sleeves in the back cover carefully, and in the last sleeve behind a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a receipt for something I could not identify, I found the number. It was written in pencil on a small piece of card that had been cut precisely to fit the sleeve, and the handwriting was my mother's. And the number was a French international number beginning with the country code. and it had been written carefully and recently enough that the pencil had not faded. And I looked at it for a long time in the noise of the station concourse, and then I took out my phone, and I looked at the number, and I dialed it. It rang once, one single ring, and then it was answered, and the man who answered did not say hello, and did not say a number or a name, and said nothing for a half second that had the quality of a held breath, and then he said a name, and the name he said was Elise. And after the name, he said, "Why now?" And he said it has been 30 years. And his voice was the voice of a man who was perhaps in his 60s, and it was a French accented English. And it was the voice of someone who had been waiting for this call for long enough that receiving it had produced something complicated, that I could hear underneath the words. I said, "I am not Elise." I said, "My name is Isla," and I said that Elise was my mother, and I said that my mother died 6 days ago, and that I found the passport in a locked drawer, and that I was calling the number because I did not know what else to do. And there was a silence after I said this. That was longer than any silence I have experienced on a telephone call, and it had a texture to it that I can only describe as grief, arriving in real time in a person who had been prepared for many things and had not been prepared for this. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The quality that had been underneath the first words was gone. And what had replaced it was something colder and more deliberate. And he said that I needed to listen carefully, and that I needed to listen without interrupting. And he said that if I had found the passport, then the protocol that my mother had maintained for 31 years had been broken. And he said that a broken protocol of that kind does not go unnoticed by the people it was designed to keep unaware. And he said that I should understand that my mother had not chosen her life in England and had been placed into it, and that the person who had placed her into it had done so because a man had been looking for her for 30 years over what he described only as a debt. And he said that the man who was owed the debt had resources and patience and had never stopped looking, and that the debt he believed was owed to him was not financial. He said the word father. He did not say my father. He said your father. And he said that my father had never stopped looking. He gave me a location. It was a specific address in Bath, and he said to come tomorrow morning at 9 and to come alone and to drive a different route than the one I would normally take and to watch the cars behind me. And he said that if I saw the same car twice, I should not come at all and should call the number again from a public telephone. I said I understood. He ended the call. I stood in the concourse for a moment, and then I walked back through the station to the multi-story, and I found my car, and I got in, and I sat there and I thought about the word father, which was a word that had never had a person attached to it in my life, because my mother had told me when I was 7 years old that my father had left before I was born, and that he had not been a good man, and that the kindest thing he had ever done was disappear. And I had accepted that the way children accept the shape of the world they are given. I started the engine. I pulled out of the parking space and I drove to the exit and I joined the road that led back toward my mother's house. And I checked the mirror the way the man on the phone had told me to, and 2 cars behind me. A dark car pulled out of a side street and settled into the traffic at the distance of 2 cars and stayed there. I pulled slowly to the curb. The dark car stopped directly behind me. I looked at it in the mirror. I did not turn around. I sat very still, and I thought about my mother at 30 years old standing on a French street with the expression of a person who is entirely at home. And I thought about 31 years of turning away from cameras and changing the channel, and the particular firmness with which she had said she did not want to go to France. And I thought about the word alive, and the way Sarah had meant it. And I understood that I had not inherited a secret. I had inherited a war. I sat in the car for 40 seconds and I counted them. I counted because counting is something to do with the mind when the mind would otherwise be doing something less useful. And what I counted while I sat at the curb with the dark car behind me was 40 seconds of stillness. And then I indicated and I pulled back into the traffic. And I did not look in the mirror again for the first 2 minutes because my mother had said something to me once that I had filed away without understanding why, and what she had said was that the most dangerous thing you can do when someone is following you is to let them know you have noticed. And I had been 11 years old when she said it, and she had framed it as general wisdom about difficult people, and I had accepted it as that. And I understood now, standing at a distance of 20 years from that conversation, that it had not been general wisdom at all. I drove into the center and I took the route through the narrow one-way system near the old market that requires 3 left turns in close succession, and which I knew from years of driving in this city creates a natural filter, because a car that follows you through all 3 turns in a one-way system with no plausible destination of its own has declared itself completely. And a car that cannot follow without declaring itself will either fall back or take a parallel route, and a parallel route in that part of the city leads away from where I was going and not toward it. And when I came out of the 3rd turn and checked the mirror, the road behind me was clear and I drove to Bath. The address Julian had given me was on a quiet street in the upper part of the city, and the building was a narrow Georgian townhouse with a sign above the door that identified it as a dealer in antiquarian maps and documents, and the kind of establishment that exists in cities like Bath as the entirely plausible business that also functions as a place where the right kind of person can have a conversation without being remarked upon. And I parked and I sat for a moment and then I went inside. The interior was exactly what the exterior suggested, which was ordered and quiet and smelled of old paper in the specific way that old paper smells, which is not unpleasant but is the smell of time preserved under controlled conditions. And there was a young woman at the front desk who looked up when I entered and said that Mr. Renard was expecting me, and she showed me through a door at the back of the main room and into a smaller room that contained 2 chairs and a low table and a lamp, and a man who stood when I entered, and who was perhaps 65 years old, and who had the bearing of a person who has spent a long time in rooms where the quality of stillness matters. His name was Julian Renard, and he looked at me for a moment before he said anything, and the look was the look of a person reading something carefully. And when he spoke, his voice was the same voice from the phone, but in person it carried an additional quality, which was the quality of someone who has been precise for so long that precision has become indistinguishable from their natural register. He said that I looked like her. I sat down. He sat down across from me and he placed his hands on his knees, and he said that he was going to tell me things that my mother had chosen not to tell me, and that he had respected her choice for 31 years, and that the choice no longer existed as a protection, and that I needed to understand what I was inside before the thing I was inside made decisions for me. He said that my mother's name had been Elise Moreau, and that she had worked for a European intelligence coordination body that no longer existed under its original structure, and that her work had been the kind of work that does not appear in official records, and that she had been exceptional at it, and that her specific skill had been the penetration of closed financial networks used by organized criminal structures operating across France and Switzerland and northern Italy, and that she had done this for 6 years with a precision and a patience that Julian described without drama as the best operational work he had seen in his career. He said that my father's name was Constantin Vanek. He said that Constantin Vanek was not a man in the ordinary sense of the word bad, which was how my mother had described him to me at 7 years old. And he said that Vanek had built over 30 years a private financial infrastructure that moved money for people who required their money to move without documentation, and that he operated from a position of such structural insulation that no law enforcement body in any jurisdiction had ever placed him within provable proximity of the thing he ran. And that the reason for that insulation was a list. He said the list was not digital in the way that Word is currently understood, and it was a record maintained in a proprietary, encrypted format developed in the early 90s that predated most current forensic tools, and that it contained the full transaction history of Vanek's network going back to its founding, which was the identities and account structures and operational details of every individual and institution that had used his infrastructure over 3 decades, and that the list was the only document in existence that could dismantle what Vanek had built, because it was the foundation the whole structure was built on, and without it, the structure had no traceable history, and with it, the structure had nothing else. He said that Elise had taken it. He said that she had spent 14 months inside Vanek's operational circle and had obtained a complete copy of the list and had removed it, and that this was the debt Vanek believed she owed him, which was not the list itself, because the list in the wrong hands was as dangerous to Vanek as it was useful to anyone pursuing him. And what he wanted was to know who had it and what had been done with it, and whether it had been copied, and how many copies existed. He said that Elise had been placed into the Catherine Voss identity in 1993, and that Julian had built the identity himself, and that it had been the cleanest erasure he had ever constructed, and that it had held for 31 years, because Elise had maintained it with a discipline that he said quietly, and with something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it, was the same discipline she had applied to everything she had ever done. He reached into the folder on the table beside his chair. He placed a photograph in front of me. It was a news clipping, and it was recent, and the date in the corner was 6 weeks ago. And the man in the photograph was standing outside a building in Geneva, and he was perhaps 68 years old. And he was well dressed, and he had the unremarkable appearance of a successful and legitimate businessman. And he was looking at something outside the frame of the photograph with an expression of complete composure. Julian said that the identity Elise had maintained had been tied to a passive signal protocol that was designed to alert no one as long as it remained active, and that the signal had stopped 6 days ago at the moment of her death, and that a signal that stops after 31 years of continuity does not go unnoticed by the people who have been waiting for it to stop. He said that Vanek had boarded a flight to London 2 days ago. He said that Vanek was already here. I looked at the photograph. I looked at the face of the man who had been looking for my mother for 30 years, and I understood that the passport in my bag was not a relic. It was the reason he was coming. I looked at the photograph for a long time, and then I looked up at Julian, and I said the thing that had been sitting in the room since he placed the clipping on the table, which was that Constantin Vanek had my eyes. And Julian looked at me steadily and said that he had wondered when I would see it, and I said that I had seen it the moment I looked at the photograph, and had taken a full minute to say it aloud, because some facts require a moment of private acknowledgement before they can be spoken in a room. And Julian nodded and said nothing, and I looked back at the photograph, and I thought about my mother at 30 years old, standing on a French street, looking at something outside the frame of the image with the expression of a person entirely at home. And I thought about the version of that story I had been carrying since I was 7 years old, which was that my father had been a man who had left, and that his leaving had been the kindest thing he had done. And I understood now that this had been the most precise and most carefully constructed lie in a life built entirely from precise and carefully constructed things. Because the truth was not that he had left, and the truth was that she had, and that she had taken me with her, and that the taking had required everything she had. Julian said that I needed to understand the logic of the list. He said that the list in isolation was dangerous to everyone, including the people who might use it, because Vanek's network had operated for 30 years, and the individuals and institutions recorded in it were not small actors, and were people with their own resources and their own interest in ensuring that the record of their participation never became visible, and that the list therefore functioned not as a weapon in the conventional sense, but as a deterrent. And the deterrent only held as long as Vanek believed that the person holding the list was capable of releasing it and had not yet done so. And that this was the reason my mother had been allowed to live for 31 years. Which was not that Vanek had stopped looking, and not that the identity had been impenetrable, but that Elise had been more valuable to him alive and silent than dead, and discovered. He said that I had inherited the deterrent along with the passport. He said that as long as Vanek believed I had the list and had not yet understood what to do with it, I was in the same position my mother had occupied, which was protected by the very threat that made me a target, and that the window of that protection was not large and would close the moment he assessed that I was either unable to use what I had or unwilling to, and that his assessment of that question would be made quickly because he had been making assessments of this kind for 30 years, and was not a man who left that kind of calculation unresolved. He said I had a choice. He said the first option was to run, and that he could provide the infrastructure for that, and that it was the option my mother would have chosen for me, and that it was a survivable option if executed correctly. But that correctly meant completely, which meant a new identity and a new country and the permanent abandonment of everything I currently was, and he said this without judgment and with the specific neutrality of a man presenting a genuine option. He said the second option was to stop. I said that I was not going to run. I said it before he finished the sentence, and he looked at me with an expression that was not surprise, and was the expression of a man who had known my mother for 30 years, and had therefore been prepared for this answer, even if he had hoped for the other one, and he said that if I was not going to run, then I needed to understand that what I was choosing was not confrontation in the emotional sense, and was confrontation in the operational sense, which meant preparation and precision and the use of every advantage available before the meeting happened rather than during it. I thought about my mother. I thought about the things she had taught me that I had received as ordinary maternal instruction, and that I was now understanding as something more deliberate than that. And I thought about the way she had taught me to remember routes, and to notice cars, and to sit in public spaces with my back to a wall, and to never assume that a conversation in a restaurant was private, and to always have a second exit identified before I needed it. And I thought about a woman who had spent 31 years preparing her daughter for a situation she had hoped would never arrive. And I understood that the preparation was the most honest thing she had ever given me, and that it had been given in the only language available to a person who could not speak the truth directly. Julian said that the sedan was outside. He said it quietly and without alarm, the way professionals communicate information that is serious but not yet critical. And I looked at him, and he nodded toward a small monitor on the shelf behind him that showed the street outside the shop, and the dark car was parked 40 meters from the entrance on the opposite side of the road, and there was a figure in the driver's seat, and the figure was not moving. I said that I wanted to send the message. Julian opened a laptop, and he navigated to a platform that had the appearance of an outdated communication interface, and he explained that the channel had been maintained as a legacy contact protocol, and that messages sent through it would reach Vanek's operational network within hours. And he turned the laptop toward me, and I sat in front of it, and I looked at the empty message field for a moment, and then I typed 11 words. The daughter of Elise Moreau is waiting, and she has the list. I pressed send. Julian said that we would have a response within 4 hours and that the response would be a location and that I should be prepared to go to the location alone, because Vanek would not come to a meeting that had the appearance of anything other than a private conversation. And I said that I understood. And Julian looked at me and said that my mother had been the most capable person he had worked with in 40 years, and that he believed she had known what she was doing when she chose to have a daughter instead of choosing the other options available to her. And I looked at him and I said that I understood what he meant, and I did. The response came in 3 hours. It was an address in the city and a time which was the following morning at 9 and nothing else. And I went that evening to the place I had chosen, which was the nave of a cathedral in the center of Bath that remained open until 10 in the evening for private reflection. And I sat in the furthest pew from the entrance with my back to the stone pillar. And I watched the high vaulted space, and I thought about 31 years, and a locked drawer, and a name on a passport, and a woman who had changed everything about herself except the instinct to protect the thing she loved most. At 8:59 the following morning, I was sitting in the same pew. At 9, the heavy doors at the end of the nave opened. A tall, well-dressed man walked in from the light. He paused when he saw me, and I looked at his eyes, and I saw my own. He walked the length of the nave slowly and without urgency in the way that powerful men move through spaces, which is as though the space has been arranged for their arrival. And he was taller than the photograph had suggested, and he wore a dark coat. And he moved with the specific stillness of a person who has never needed to hurry, because the things he has wanted have always waited for him. And he stopped at the pew across from mine, and he looked at me for a long moment before he sat down, and the looking had a quality to it that I recognized because I had seen it in the mirror my entire life, which was the quality of a person who processes the world through assessment before anything else, and who has never entirely learned to turn that assessment off, even when it would be more appropriate to feel something. Instead, he sat down. The cathedral was empty at that hour, except for an elderly man near the front who was not paying attention to us, and the light through the high windows was the flat gray light of an October morning, and the space between our two pews was perhaps 4 feet, and felt like considerably more. He said that I had my mother's face. He said it the way you say something that costs you something to say, which is quietly and only once. And then he moved past it, and his voice when he moved past it became the voice I had expected, which was elegant and precise. And underneath the elegance was something that I can only describe as the specific authority of a man who has never in his adult life been in a room where he did not hold the most power, and who had therefore never developed the capacity to imagine what that room would feel like. He said that I had my mother's courage as well, but that courage without infrastructure was a liability and not an asset, and that I was a young woman who had found a passport in a drawer 1 week ago, and that he had spent 30 years building something that I could not comprehend from the position I was currently in, and that the most intelligent thing available to me was to give him what he had come for and allow him to leave, and to understand that what he was offering in exchange was the thing my mother had bought with 31 years of her life, which was simply that I would be left alone. I looked at him. I thought about my mother on a Sunday evening asking me how work was. I thought about a woman who had made herself small and still and invisible for 31 years so that this moment would never arrive. And I thought about the fact that it had arrived anyway. And I thought about what she had done with the understanding that it might. And I thought about Julian and the old laptop and the 11 words I had typed, and the thing that those 11 words had set in motion, which was not a meeting and was a mechanism. I said that I wanted to explain something to him about the list. He said that he was not interested in explanations, and that he was interested only in the transfer of the file and the confirmation of how many copies existed. And I said that I understood that, and that the explanation would address both of those questions directly. And he looked at me with the expression of a man deciding whether to allow something, and then he said that I had 2 minutes. I said that the list had never been a static file. I said that my mother and Julian had spent the first 3 years of her life as Catherine Voss converting the list from its original format into a distributed encrypted protocol that existed across 7 separate servers in 4 different countries, and that the protocol was not accessible through any single credential, and was instead maintained through a timed verification sequence that required a specific code to be entered every 24 hours from a device registered to the protocol, and that the code was mine and had been transferred to me through documentation Julian had prepared for exactly this contingency, and that if the code was not entered within the 24-hour window, the protocol released automatically, and the release sent the complete contents of the list simultaneously to the intelligence services of France and Germany and Switzerland and Italy and the United Kingdom, and to 3 investigative journalists whose specialization made them precisely the right recipients. I said that the release was not something I could stop after a certain point even if I wanted to, and that Julian had designed it that way deliberately, so that no conversation of the kind we were currently having could result in the protocol being neutralized through any form of coercion, because coercion requires the possibility of compliance, and compliance was structurally unavailable. I said that I had entered the code that morning. I said that I would enter it again tomorrow morning. I said that the only variable was whether I continued to enter it. He looked at me for a long time, and the assessment that lived behind his eyes was working at full capacity. And I watched it work, and I watched the moment when it reached its conclusion, which was the same conclusion I had reached when Julian explained the protocol to me the previous afternoon, which was that the architecture was complete, and that there was no approach available that did not end in the release, and that the release ended everything he had built, and that the only navigable position was the one my mother had occupied for 31 years, which was a permanent and unresolvable stalemate. I said that I wanted him to go back to Geneva. I said that I wanted him to dismantle the surveillance and recall every person he had placed in Bristol and Bath. And I said that I wanted him to understand that the debt he believed my mother owed him had been paid in full by 31 years, of a life she should not have had to live. And I said the last thing slowly and clearly because I wanted it to be the thing he carried out of the cathedral and back across the channel. And I said that my mother had erased herself to save me, and that I was now erasing him, and that the erasing was already done, and that what he was sitting in was the aftermath of it. He stood. He looked at me one final time with my own eyes. And he walked back down the nave and through the heavy doors, and the doors closed behind him, and the sound of the closing echoed in the vaulted space for a moment. And then the cathedral was quiet, and I sat in the quiet for a long time before I stood up and walked out into the October morning. I drove back to Bristol. I drove to my mother's house, and I went inside, and I went upstairs to the bedroom, and I picked up the passport from the desk where I had left it, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the name Elise Moreau for the last time, and I looked at my mother's face at 30 years old. And I thought about a woman who had been exceptional at her work and who had chosen to become someone smaller and quieter and less visible than she was because the thing she was protecting was worth more to her than everything she had been. And I thought about 31 years of tea in the evening and the particular mug on the drying rack and the notepad beside the telephone and the list of things she had meant to do. I went downstairs. I stood at the kitchen sink and I held the passport over the steel basin and I lit the corner of it with the lighter from the kitchen drawer and I watched it burn and I held it until the last moment and then I set it in the basin and I watched it finish and I ran the water over the ash and I watched the ash go. I was not Catherine Voss. I was not the daughter of Elise Moreau. I was not the thing Constantin Vanek had come to reclaim. I was the thing my mother had built in the only way available to her, which was in secret and over time and with the complete and unconditional commitment of a person who understood that the most important structure she would ever make was not made from documents or protocols or 30 years of careful silence, but from the ordinary days of a life given to someone else entirely. And I was standing in the kitchen of that life, and the passport was ash in the basin, and the code was entered, and tomorrow I would enter it again, and the day after that, and every day that followed, because that was the inheritance, and I had accepted it, and it was enough. Some people hide their secrets to protect themselves. My mother hid hers to protect me. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a lie and a foundation. And I was still standing. If this story found you somewhere real, then leave a comment below and tell me what part of it stayed with you. Because I read every single one and the ones that arrived quietly from someone who needed to hear. That the thing they were left with is not a burden, but a strength are the ones I think about most. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do it now, because there are more stories coming, and every one of them is about someone who looked at what they were given and chose to understand it rather than burn it. And if this gave you something today, a like takes 2 seconds and helps this reach the person who needs to hear it next, and I will see you in the next story.